Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Ben Solomon. I'm a professor at the University at Albany, State University of New York. I've been working on sort of math assessment and math intervention for a very long time now. I consult sort of locally, and I've been doing research um, with a number of actually speakers that have presented at Patton, including Dr. Brian Ponce and Dr. Amanda Vanderheyden. And I've also done a lot of math advocacy work with various people, including another speaker here, Dr. Anna Stocky, who's absolutely amazing. Um, and so, across those experiences, we've really developed a sense of not only what structurally needs to be in place, in terms of, what is effective assessment and intervention, but we've developed a greater appreciation for sort of the underpinnings, the things that maintain high quality assessment and intervention. So I want to talk about that today because I think it often doesn't get the credit it deserves. So the agenda for today, we don't have that long, so this is really going to be a whirlwind tour. As far as the structure I speak of, I'm going to give you a lot of resources you can follow up on. I mean, but we could spend days talking about this. So this really is sort of just a quick sampling of sort of, where our thoughts are right now in terms of what are high quality teaming systems that need to be maintained to promote really good math outcomes or reading outcomes. The systems are virtually identical in terms of the teaming structure. The first thing I'm going to talk about is MTSS, and I know many people are familiar with MTSS and can probably educate me on it in this, in the audience. But you can't talk about teaming without discussing one of the most important assumptions of MTSS. So I'm going to run through that quickly, but it has to be stated. And then I'm going to go through a teaming structure that's pretty comprehensive and research is starting to show is really critical to promoting the best outcomes for our students, where we have an interlocking teaming structure at the district, school, and grade level that differentiates a little from sort of older thinking where we tended to focus on the school level and also tended to see that school level team as a dedicated problem solving team, the team that fielded, for example, the tier two problems. Their their role has changed, and we've also added additional teams to make sure we have a completely sort of vertically aligned, system that promotes really good communication and really good decision making. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, and this is related to MTSS, but the first thing I want to do is sort of is plead with you about the vital importance of teaming because again, it often doesn't get the credit it deserves. Okay, MTSS and its ancestor RTI have been around for a very long time at this point, right? If we look at the work of Stan Dino and then his students, and and then sort of the 2004 IDEA renewal that resulted in sort of the codification of RTI nationally, and we look at different states' implementations. RTI is all over the place, right? And I'm from New York, obviously, and we have RTI in virtually every school, at least in namesake. It actually, when it's implemented well, of course, it's been shown highly effective, but the problem is it's not being implemented correctly in the vast, 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 vast majority of cases. All right. And it's one of the reasons critics have accused RTI of being a watch and fail model, right? Because they're saying lots of schools do RTI, but we haven't seen our scores increase. One of the key reasons that is the case isn't because RTI is sort of fundamentally flawed. It's not. It's a constellation of evidence-based practices. It should work. The problem has to do with how those systems, which can be fairly complicated, are maintained within the school system. How different people can respond to data with agility and make sure those decisions then get carried into real classroom applications. It's making sure we have the capacity and knowledge of the different systems and we can maintain them. That's the aspect we didn't fully appreciate when RTIs came to town in the first place. And that's why teaming is so vital. And recent research coming from various places, have really identified this as sort of the missing link. So one of my absolute favorite quotes that I think sort of summarizes everything I just said Put a good practice in a bad system, and the system wins no contest. Whenever I go to work in the morning, I start with this quote because it directs pretty much everything I do, right? I can't take credit for this. This actually comes from the Michigan Technical Assistance Center, my MTSS project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That's led by Kimberly St. Martins, who was, I'll talk about a little bit later. She's, intellectually, you're going to see her stamp all over this presentation. And then she adapted it actually from Deming, who was a famous economist. And actually, his quote was, "Put a good person in a bad system, and the system wins no contest." But with schools, we throw in practice, and it works just as well. And again, for me, this quote is really powerful because it explains why we struggle to implement RTI historically, right? We had these great ideas; they were well validated. In experimental situations, we showed it worked, but then we inserted these practices into systems that didn't communicate well with each other, didn't have a lot of competency, didn't know how to make decisions. And a lot of these great ideas, when they made contact with those school systems, frankly, sort of withered and died, even though they were great ideas. And I'm sure every one of you can relate to this. Bringing a good idea into a school system, even if it has all the evidence in the world, and then having that idea sort of fizzle out. I've been working with a school psychologist locally here who was trying to implement spring math in a local school district, and she came in so well trained and so competent, and she worked as hard as she could over the course of several years. But you could tell the systems weren't quite in place to maintain. The implementation capacity of spring math, and you could start seeing it wither. And so the the importance of teaming is that it can support the systems that support the good practices, and that really has been shown to be just as important as the practices themselves. All right, so now we're going to pivot into MTSS very quickly. And how am I conceptualizing MTSS? So I'm actually going to use a model that myself and several colleagues created for New York. New York has a SPDIG project, a small sort of experimental implementation project occurring in a sort of a larger cohort of a couple dozen schools in New York. And I helped write the blueprint for that project. And we boiled MTSS down into four main elements: systems capacity, assessment and decision making, instruction and intervention, and program fidelity. And I'm not going to review each of these, individually, but I just want to point out teaming is really fundamental to each of these core areas, right? Teaming is essentially what creates the system capacity to hold these individual assessment and intervention practices. It's how we ensure assessment and decision making is being done correctly. It's how we ensure instruction and the intervention that we've determined works best for our students is maintained with integrity, and we can make safe and sound decisions regarding response to intervention, right? And it's what ensures program fidelity. So we need teaming to support all four of these pillars. And every state has a different model of MTSS at this point, but they all look very much alike in terms of what their sort of key pillars are, their key foundations. And so I just wanted to point out that teaming is really needed to support all of these areas. So people are familiar with the triangle. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, right? Sort of the classic 80-15-5 split. There can be some variation in there, but we expect 80% of our students to respond to what every student gets, our Tier 1 curriculum. 15 may need a little something extra, and the 5%, needs to be individualized, intensive intervention. And we use that MTSS framework to increase the effectiveness of instruction, right? Rapidly identify students being left behind, create systems of continuous improvement, and importantly, implement and adjust evidence-based practices so that we maintain, or we establish and then maintain, those proportions. So the whole point of MTSS is to ensure all our practices are effective, that we're getting the expected proportions, and if we're not, we're changing the practices, understanding that it's our responsibility to create an environment that that where students respond versus then assuming it's a student's responsibility to respond to what we're providing to them. And here's the kicker, right? If we make a decision of non-responsiveness with a student, we're making a number of assumptions as to what that student received. So if we say, hey, this student is not responding to our tier 1 instruction, okay, they require tier 2. But the tier 1 instruction we thought they were getting, they really weren't getting. Maybe teacher 1 is doing something, teacher 2 is doing something else, teacher 3 is doing something else entirely. Um, you know, and then in another school, they're all doing their own thing, right? Um, you have a cluster of teachers, and I'm sure you see this. You have your with math, your discovery learning constructivist camp, and they have a certain set of procedures, and then you have other teachers that may be sort of in the sort of DI explicit instruction camp, and they're doing their own thing, and that's great and all, but now when we say a student doesn't respond, we actually have no idea what they're not responding to. And so we can't make a decision about RTI. And this becomes increasingly consequential as you move up the tiers, because at some point you may use non-responsiveness as a determination for learning disability. And if you make that determination when in actuality you have no idea what's been implemented and with what integrity, your decision is invalid. Implementation integrity and knowing exactly what students received and in what dose is a fundamental assumption of MTSS and RTI. And if you don't have that, you can't engage in that decision making. And that's why teaming is so critical, because it helps support that implementation integrity and that knowledge of what's going on. And it creates consistency across classrooms and schools so you can make those decisions with confidence. All right, so now we're going to get into the teaming structure. Before I get into the structure, I really want to give credit to the sources that I've used to sort of create this presentation and create these recommendations. The first, I'm sure many people are familiar with the TIPS model, team implemented problem solving. That comes out of the PBIS literature. I'm going to explain it later in this lecture, okay? But if you're familiar with TIPS, you're definitely going to see a lot of influences from it in terms of how the forms are created, in terms of the thought process. That is a routine that facilitates good decision making. It creates the systems in which the practices can flourish, going back to that quote. Uh, the text MTSS to promote equity. I don't know if, well, actually, let me just see something. If that's actually MTSS. Hold on one second. I have the book. Sorry. I had the title wrong. Leading equity-based MTSS. I'm sorry about that. As soon as I read it, I knew I had the title wrong. The title's Leading Equity-Based MTSS for All Students. Here's the book. It's a fantastic book, okay? It is short, it is concise, and it offers a number of really great suggestions. It has some really great handouts for how to engage in MTSS very practically and and coming from within the school. So if people have read that book, you're going to see influences from it within this presentation. The New York Educational Partnership, you can visit their website. If you type in New York Educational Partnership into Google, it should be the first thing that comes up. There's a vast trove of resources related to MTSS implementation going up through the tiers. A lot of the handouts that you'll see today, a lot of the material were strongly influenced from that project. I was a director on that project for 5 years, and on that project, I led sort of the all the professional development creation as it related to reading and math. So a lot of that I borrowed over here. And last, and I've already pointed this out, Michigan's multi MTSS project led by Kimberly St. Martin. She was actually a great collaborator when I was working on the New York Educational Partnership. She looked at our materials, she gave us tips, we integrated a lot of her materials, like the reading tiered fidelity inventory, into our professional development. So you're going to see some influences from that project as well within this structure. So once we conclude, if you're looking for further information about sort of, in terms of how to really dig into the weeds in terms of setting up good comprehensive teams, these are four great resources for you to use. All right. So again, we're going to talk about a teaming structure that involves districts, school, and grade level. These teams are vertically aligned. They communicate with each other. They share representation, and it creates a communication chain going from the top to the very bottom. I'm sure many people in the audience can relate that one of the biggest problems a consultant has when they walk into a school or is communication, right? The district is doing something but not explaining the rationale to the school. The school leadership is doing something but not explaining the rationale to the individual teachers, and it creates a ton of frustration. And decisions are often made in error because data isn't being shared up and down the pipeline, so those decisions are being made in a vacuum. So we want a three-tiered structure where there's cross-representation across those teams. So there's a great pathway for data to move up the chain for where big decisions are made at a district level, and for decisions to be walked down the chain where everyone feels like they've had a say. We're going to start with the district level team, and the district level team has a couple more general purposes. One, identifying assessment and instructional materials that schools in the district can use and need, and adjusting those decisions based on ongoing data, ensuring consistency in decision making and practice. Importantly, sustaining institutional knowledge and archiving of key information. Schools these days, I'm sure everyone's experienced it. There's just enormous levels of attrition in schools, staff turnover. We're having a whole generation of teachers that are retiring out of the system, but we also have young teachers that are under a lot of pressure and feel like they don't want to do this, and so are leaving. And so it's what the district can really do, which is super helpful, is ensure all of this documentation occurs of decisions through record keeping and through the development of, say, implementation plans and policy that make sure that when people leave, their intellectual contribution is preserved. Identifies funding priorities such as grants, and also maybe advocacy at the local level. That's something really, at the school or classroom level, someone can't do. And is also can advocate with constituents in the district. Of particular importance is making sure at the district level that team can be crucial in ensuring curriculum and materials are consistent across the district. And that goes back to one of my original points, right? You may have one school that, for example, is using iReady math and assessments. You may have a second school that's using Go Math and FastBridge, and a third school that uses Envision and STAR. So this is pretty common where schools are often given a budget and said, hey, you make your own decisions, whatever you want to do. And that sounds good in one respect because you're offering flexibility to the school, but it's really antithetical to MTSS because you want consistency. So again, when you have to make instructional decisions, you know what students are responding to. If you have a ton of different programs operating in your district, that means they're probably not being done with good implementation fidelity. You want everyone with really high in-depth knowledge of a few practices in your school. That's going to lead to good decisions. And that actually was a finding from medicine. What they found is that standard protocol implementations, for example, cancer treatments, increased survivability. So even if you had a bunch of really, bright, talented, nationally recognized doctors in the room, and they all were, given the freedom to make their own individual decisions, they often made more errors than had they convened as a panel at the very beginning, agreed to a menu of treatments that they agreed they all would demonstrate absolute mastery of, and then stuck with that menu, even though it was more limited options in terms of the treatment they could provide. They found that the implementation integrity mattered more than the diverse array of options. and that increased survivability. We take that, it's called a standard protocol model. We take that model and can easily transport it into schools. And that's a key role of the district team is to take input from all the different schools, make sure everyone's heard out, right? Have representation on your team from everyone, but come to common decisions in terms of what curriculum and assessments are being used. And then rationalize it and have your cross membership down the chain represent those decisions within the more local groups. So the district team should include district level leadership. That's super huge, by the way. It's been found that when these teams lack, you know, high power administrators, or those high power administrators don't attend meetings, or it becomes very clear they're disinterested, the team is sort of dead in the water because they don't have decision making authority. So you want to make sure in the district level team, there's an assistant superintendent or a superintendent who's attending every meeting. And if they can't attend those meetings, it may not be worth establishing the team in the first place because you're going to waste people's time. That visibility of leadership is really important. You want school level leadership, literacy and math content and assessment experts. You want representation from the community so they feel they have a stake in those kinds of decisions. And you want a district team coordinator who's going to manage the whole operation. Ideally, this is 5 to 10 people. If it's any larger than this, the team's probably gonna be dragged down by too many voices. So you want to keep it representative but tight, and you want them to meet monthly. As far as data they use, you want screening data, state test data, fidelity implementation data, and community input coming from the schools being organized by a designated person and being presented regularly at the district level meeting in an efficient, organized way. So if you have your tech person, who's keeping track, for example, of all the screening data and state test data and aggregating that data, you want them always sort of creating sort of visuals and summaries that can be presented at the district level so they can make informed decisions based on the data they're seeing, and they can see where there's variability across schools and whether maybe all schools should be doing the same thing as we just discussed, or maybe there's certain variations based on certain populations that can be strategically deployed. So you want clear data sources designated, maintained, with a process for how it will be fed up to the district level for decision making. One of my biggest points that I've been hollering about, as I'm sure many of you have for years now, when you establish your district level team, there may be a desire to address the most severe cases in the district, right? Address all the students who are at a tier 2 or tier 3 level who require the most significant supports, rushing to think about what kinds of materials would benefit those students. It it can require a lot of discipline, okay, to convince schools that they actually need to start at tier 1. The core curriculum is the most important variable in terms of, and its high quality implementation that dictates the overall health and success of the schools. Not just for the students that remain in tier 1, by the way. It is the most important variable for virtually all students in the school, including the students that receive tier 2 and tier 3 supports and our students with disabilities. Schools that have really high quality tier 1, they tend to have better outcomes, not just for for students that don't have additional needs. They tend to show really good outcomes across all students, including those with needs at tier 2 or tier 3 or other individualized considerations. So the first job of your district at your district level is not, as someone used to tell me, put out the fires, that being the priority. The priority is not to quote unquote put out the fires. The priority is to make sure you have a really tight core so you can make sound decisions and you can affect the most students efficiently. So always start with a reconsideration of what your schools are doing at tier one, and make sure you have really high quality responsiveness at tier one, which may take more than a year, before you start considering your intensified supports. That's the priority. All right. So that's the district team in a nutshell. Now let's move on to the school level. So the school level team monitors school-wide aggregated data sources. And again, this isn't your pre-referral team. I want to make a very clear distinction there. So historically, a pre-referral team was a school level team where you had people from various discipline specializations coming in, right? And they would sort of receive concerns from teachers, and frankly, inevitably, 99% of those cases turned into referrals. So that was a pre-referral team. And then when RTI came around, we talked about problem-solving teams. And the problem-solving team was also a team at the school level, or very often, with faculty and staff from various specializations. And what separated them from pre-referral teams was sort of their use of data and evidence-based practice. So they would still receive those concerns, or they would proactively raise concerns with teachers because they were monitoring data, but they would identify sort of um, individualized sort of solutions with students. That's again different than a school level team within this MTSS system. The school level team is monitoring the health of the entire MTSS system. Again, starting at tier one, that's the priority. And then once that's established, moving to tier two and then tier three. They can work with individual students or consider individual problems, all right? But we're actually going to learn later, we're going to shift some of that responsibility over to grade level teams. Their overall job is to maintain the fidelity to MTSS for the entire school structure and adapt it as needed based on data, which is aggregated across all the classrooms, prepared for the school level team and reviewed. When you establish your school level team, it's really important you not be duplicative. Oftentimes, there are a lot of teams operating in schools. They sometimes are disconnected. I'm sure you've experienced this. There was a special interest group here, and they're doing a book study, and they've been doing it for a couple of years over in this corner. And in this corner, someone spoke to the principal about the importance of additional phonics instruction, which is great. Or we can put in the math, in terms of additional fluency instruction. And so they're working hard over here, but they're still isolated. And all of a sudden, you don't realize you have like 6 or 7 teams all overlapping on similar content. And again, none with decision-making authority. The creation of a team is not a solution. That's a common mistake I see in the schools I work in, is they declare a team will be created, a focus group, a committee, but it's really important people recognize that the action of establishing committee is not really an evidence-based strategy. So one of the first things we like to do when we're establishing our school level team is do a teaming audit. And again, this came out of my work in New York when I was working in a group on developing the New York State blueprint for MTSS. It was actually another wonderful colleague that helped draft up this form and suggest this as an initial activity. One of the first activities you should be engaging in is doing a teaming audit. So first things first, do a survey around the school. Ask everyone in the team after you initially set it up, hey, before we talk about anything, let's review. What teams do we currently have in the school? What are the purpose? What outcomes do they use to make decisions? What student groups are supported? Who's on those teams? And do we need it? Or does it overlap with what we're currently trying to do? Do we need to be a team? Is there another team we can sort of jerry-rig to become the school MTSS team? This is also important because you want to be very careful and mindful of staff resources and time, right? If you have too many teams going, everyone's flustered because they don't have enough time to do anything well. And so by doing a teaming audit and potentially reducing the number of teams and consolidating to the school level, team level, you're going to save potentially everyone a lot of time, and that's important. Once you've done your audit and you have your school level team and you know it's not overlapping or in conflict with other teams, you want to consider the specific roles of your individual members. When we establish these teams, we need a couple roles, a facilitator, a note taker, data analyst, representative team members. Again, just like the district, it's crucial you have an administrator. That visibility is really important. People need to know the team actually has decision-making authority. And you want a timekeeper. And again, this all comes from the TIPS the TIPS Foundation, which I'll go into. So when we conduct our meeting, we use team implemented problem solving. Again, this comes out of the PBIS literature. They very astutely noticed that even though PBIS has some wonderful elements to it, right? It is a very well researched, evidence-based framework for supporting students' behavioral and social emotional growth when done executed correctly. But even though those fundamentals were well validated, they struggled with implementation integrity because there's different parts of the system there. And what they found is that when they had these meetings where they discussed data, teachers and staff and administrators would often get stuck in what we call problem admiration. They would acknowledge the data, they would recognize its severity, but they didn't know how to turn it into actually instructional decision making, how to turn it into validated solutions. That was where one of the gears kept spinning. And I'm sure many of you have seen that. I see that all the time in the schools I work in. The schools are screening consistently. They are drowning in data, but they don't know quite how to move it into action. And so TIPS was created to get that ball rolling. And within the New York work, we adapted it on the academic side, and it's been working well because it's a generic framework. There's nothing specific to behavior with it. And what TIPS is it's a semi-standardized meeting routine. So handout number two, sorry, I didn't point out. Handout number one was the team audit form. Okay, so that I provided you copies of that. Handout number two is actually the TIPS form, um, and I've adapted it, but it follows a version we created for the New York partnership, and it follows a TIPS framework. There's different parts to it, in terms of identifying when the team meets and who's on it and what the mission of it is. So there's different parts that making sure old business is resolved, revisiting people who have been identified as being responsible for different actions. But towards the bottom, this is the crux, in my opinion. This is the most important box on that form. And what this form does is it compels people to convert data into solutions. And so we use our data at the school level to develop a problem statement. I'm going to provide some examples of that. And once we have our problem statement, then we then need to generate a solution. And we can generate a solution at a school-wide level along three dimensions. And people, I'm sure, are familiar with the ICE or ISIL acronym: instruction, curriculum, environment. When we talk about individual students, we also reference the individual characteristics of the learner. That's how we get ISIL. But at a school-wide level, we're dealing with all learners, so we cut off the L and we get ICE. Instruction, curriculum, environment. How are we going to modify the instruction provided to students? Do we need to modify the curriculum provided to students? Do we need to modify the behavioral supports, the environment in which those two things are delivered to promote a better outcome for these students based on the problem? Who's going to do it? Who's going to be responsible? When are we going to do it? When's our time-bound goal? All right, and then the specific goal on the right-hand side that determines success. So this is one of the final boxes on that form, and it's the box I feel is most important because it compels the team to engage in really good instructional decision making. It creates that system in which the practices can thrive. So as I discussed, every solution is a modification, right? We always want to be thinking about the overall school context as generating the student's behavior. It's not the student's fault that they're struggling with math, right? At a school-wide level. It's the supports we provide, and we can organize those and change them. And I've talked about this. Every action should include a time-bound goal. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the SMART acronym: specific, measurable, attainable, um, uh, specific, measurable, um, attainable, what's it? Blanking on the R. Um, reasonable and time bound. So, right. Um, how am I blanking on the R? Anyway, sorry. People are familiar with that framework, and you want goals, and I'm going to show you examples that that lead to good decision making and that create a clear boundary for how to evaluate the goal. You want to use local expectations to determine that goal. So in terms of, what kind of goals you want, that's sort of, a different subject entirely. I know there's been some good presentations on establishing goals, but you need to look at what your expectations are, your normative performance within the school, and make a decision about what sort of your social expectations are in terms of their achievement. So again, I've talked about the three areas you can consider changes at the school level. That includes instruction, the instructional routines and techniques used to deliver curriculum, the curriculum itself, the content, material, and sequence, and the environment. And so to give you an example of the first one, if we're reconsidering the instruction we're delivering to students, um, we may be considering the use, for example, of explicit instruction in the classroom, right? Maybe we're in a situation where math achievement is, pretty low, and we've done observations in the classroom, we've looked at our data, and we've looked at the routines that are being done, and we see really that a lot of playtime, if you will, is being done. A lot of discovery learning. Students are engaging in sort of these really advanced, sort of self-driven topics that they're not ready for. So we want to shift that around. Or maybe we want to implement a school-wide cover, copy, compare procedure. We want to look at our curriculum and whether it aligns with good tenets of instruction. We can do that across our tiers. And then, of course, the environment. And I'm sure people are also probably familiar with the RIOT acronym: records, interviews, observations, and tests. And we want to use these different data points to inform that problem statement and generate these solutions. So as an example, if we're thinking about tier one, which I told you we want to stick at for a while, 70% of students were identified as at risk on the fall NWEA math screening, with average performance based on national norms of 20%. Target performance at this screening period is 58 based on national norms. So in this situation, 70% of students were identified as at risk. Obviously, that's way too much based on our tier one expectations. And so we want to shift that around so the proportion of students who are determined not at risk goes way up. But that's our clear, measurable problem statement. And we also, again, define the expectation, because we acknowledge the expectation may vary across schools, districts, and also, importantly, vendors. As I've stated before, we use behavioral logic with the TIPS framework. As we think about the problems across our school, we we don't blame the parents, we don't blame the kids, we blame the environment, right? All students learn, and all students can learn a great deal if the environment is tuned to their learning needs in terms of high quality curriculum. So we want to make sure we think of all these environmental, variables as changeable, right? And recognize that if we create the right combination, we'll get students that do respond, right? You can, I know it sounds wild, but you can get 90-95% of students meeting benchmark on your math assessment if your curriculum and instructional environmental, supports are well situated. So we like to think of, again, every problem as a discrepancy between what our students currently can do and what our sort of environmental expectations are, and what we need to do as faculty and staff to bridge that gap. And again, this is old news. We think about this at the individual level, but we can think about it at the class-wide and grade level too. So back to our example from the NWEA data. Here's an example of how we may address that problem. We can extend daily core math instruction by 10 minutes and maybe embed a fluency building exercise that uses high levels of feedback. To do that, to engage in that instructional routine where we increase opportunities to respond and build in some fluency exercises, which if you were with me yesterday, is a great bang for your buck. To do that, we can create our own materials, but that's pretty effortful, and we're apt to do something maybe incorrect there. We're going to use a vendor that's really, really vetted good materials for doing this kind of instruction. And a good vendor for that is Spring Math, which has really high quality assessment materials, high quality intervention materials, a very well developed instructional routine. I know a number of people in the audience are familiar with Spring Math, and also makes a lot of the instructional decisions for you based on the data you input. So we're going to use the Spring Math program because it has scientific evidence that it's a high quality, what we may call tier 1.5 curriculum. And if we follow that routine, it will bring the instruction with it. And environmental will incentivize skills mastered for each classroom with weekly goals and semester-long competition. So we'll make it fun. With Spring Math, what I think is really cool is students tend to move through the skills pretty quickly. In a given grade, they may have several dozen skills they need to master, but they'll move through them quick, usually within a week or two. So you can make that, part of the game, right? Is how many skills are we going to master this month, this year? Let's have a competition. And so you can incentivize this to make that math, that math practice, fun and enjoyable, and something students look forward to. And then we can put this all into our TIPS decision-making framework. And here, we're going to make sure we designate who's responsible by when, and then also included a database decision rule. So for example, by February 1st, at least 50% of the student body will have improved at least 10 percentile points on their NWEA assessment. This isn't the final goal, but this is our initial short-term goal as we move towards, reorienting our pyramid. Okay, so the grade level team is next. And the grade level team is a bit of, I think, a new addition to sort of the overall teaming structure. Grade level teachers have been meeting in groups for a very long time. That's certainly nothing new. But we can actually take advantage of those meeting times and turn them into problem-solving meetings, such that teachers are actually engaging in decision-making regularly within their grade. And I think it was actually Lynn Fuchs a number of years ago who was commenting about some recent findings about RTI and why nationally it didn't seem to be raising the bar. And she commented that one of the limitations she saw with RTI was that, again, it tended to rely on the school-wide problem-solving team. And she commented that if we I don't want to say offload, if empowered is the better word here, if we empower teachers to do to make some of those decisions in terms of tier 1 and tier 2 within their own grades, that might be a way to make it more efficient and also get people to take greater ownership of it because it would raise their skill level too in terms of making responsive decision making and seeing growth. So, from that commentary, and I know it's discussed in a number of the resources I mentioned, um, came sort of the conceptualization of grade level teams that follow a sort of tips framework. So on the grade level team, you want grade level teachers, you want an administrator or support staff. Again, that administrator is very important. I actually worked in a district a long time ago in Massachusetts, and the principal met with every grade level team. Every season, they went over their triannual screening data, and the teachers would put the data on the table. The principal would meet with them. The principal actually had all the benchmarks wallpapered behind her, and they would talk it out. Which classrooms, through no fault of the teachers necessarily, um, different distributions of students, which classrooms were meeting benchmarks, which weren't, what could they do about it, how could they share resources, and it was very positive. But that administrator, knowing the administrator is there and partnering with you is important. They can review outcome and fidelity data to make both grade, class, and student adjustments. So they can talk about their entire grade level instruction and where they want it to go. That alignment is really important. I'm sure many of you have been in situations where, for example, you go into grade 2 and teacher A is using one math curriculum, teacher 2 is making up their own math curriculum, and teacher 3 is doing something else entirely. And that again creates a lot of confusion and basically invalidates any ability to use RTI, MTSS within your decision making because there's an assumption that what you're presenting does work or should work for most students. So when you put teachers in a room and give them a process to discuss the choices they've made or the procedures they're using, it gives them an opportunity to consider their data and standardize their practice across the teachers. And again, this offers coordination and allows sort of, a good discussion based on data. It also can be important for teachers that, for example, are falling behind in certain areas. So teacher 1 may have a good routine, teacher 2 needs some help. They can put the data there, see those discrepancies, and reorient. It can also be a situation where students move during you know, sort of what some schools call RTI time. I don't love that term, but during the times where sort of level differentiated instruction has been sort of scheduled, you can reorient across the teachers based on the strengths and weaknesses in the data you're seeing across the teachers. So at this grade level team, we have a different form, and this is handout number 3. And this also uses the ICE framework, instruction, curriculum, environment, but it situates it just a little differently based on how, that's just a little bit more friendly at the grade level. And just like before with the school level team and the district level team, it's designed to really facilitate the use of data in determining sort of where the gaps are. So here's that form, which you can pull up in the PDF. And you can see here it has 3 different areas. Again, the instruction curriculum environment is going down the left-hand side. And then it sort of moves through the problem-solving process as you move left to right. And so when teachers meet, within their grade to discuss their practices, they have the data, their triannual screening data with them. And what I encourage them to do is sort of outline across the 3 areas. So in terms of instruction, what do you do? What are your typical instructional routines? How much time are you devoting to different areas in math? How much is explicit instruction? How much is worksheet activity? How much is fluency, fluency drills? How much is small group? What are you doing in those small groups? And oftentimes you'll see teachers say different things. So you want to, again, encourage standardization. Curriculum, what materials are teachers using? And again, oftentimes teachers, especially teachers that have been in the business for a while, they've aggregated their own collection of materials they bring in at different times. It can often be the case, and I see this a lot, where you have teachers that don't like a certain curriculum or are concerned with some of the recommendations being offered by, at the school level, and so they've shut their door and are doing their own thing. And I don't know if you can stop that, but at least in this form, that you can compel them to acknowledge what they're doing, because maybe they're doing something really useful and is compelling really good outcomes in their students. And so you want to be able to share that information. And last, the behavioral supports. And so this compels the teachers to, again, state what they're doing, but then in light of the data and where they want to go, based on sort of the environmental expectations, theorize as to what they need to do. Write the goals, and again, by who and by when. So here's an example application. And so I've made up this data, and we can say this is a third grade team. And say, for example, this school screens, you have two classes here. So you have two teachers, and they screen using iReady Math. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, iReady Math produces a vertically scaled score. It doesn't really mean anything in its natural form, right? If I say, oh, this student's at a 452, you don't automatically know whether that student's proficient in math or not. And if in either case, what they can or can't do, right? So that vertically scaled standardized score is connected to a percentile, and the percentile conveys some information about what the student, where the student's at. So they have triannual, screening here, and so we can say this is, fall data, and because iReady is a computer adaptive test that doesn't really dig into specifics, maybe we also give some math curriculum-based measures too, to really dig into what we might call big ticket predictive skills that students really need to know. For example, multi-digit subtraction, that's pretty important, right? Multi-digit addition, subtraction from 18, and addition to 18. So in this third grade classroom, we really want to make sure these, even regardless of what the iReady screening says, we want to make sure these three skills are shored up. So we've selected these additionally as screeners across the two classrooms. So there's a couple things we can notice here, right? The first thing is that there seems to be greater responsiveness to the curriculum in classroom 1 versus classroom 2. Based on iReady benchmarks, the majority of students in classroom 1 are doing okay, but the majority of students in classroom 2 are below benchmark. So that can compel a discussion of, okay, what's going on here? It may very well be this is the fall. So if one teacher happens to be more confident in math instruction, that probably hasn't had an effect yet. Okay, so one teacher probably just got distributed through your typical assignment procedures, a majority of students that were, at least as iReady measures it, on the weaker side with math. This compels the two teachers to have a discussion. All right, you have this problem. How can I help you? How can we strategize so that by winter, we see improvement across both classrooms? And oftentimes this entails students switching across classrooms based on the teacher's strengths. We see here with these three specific skills that all students, or most students in the three classrooms, are weak. So now we can think of sort of a grade level solution. All right. What can we do across the teachers so we can bring these three skills up? And last, we see here addition to 18, right? And in this situation, again, one teacher has students that are stronger than the other group. And again, the question becomes, all right, how can we strategize here? Is there something teacher can do very easily to boost that up? Or is there something teacher 1 can do, right, based on her experience to support teacher 2 in boosting that up? It's not a grade level problem. it's a specific class problem. So we don't need to think of maybe a whole grade level solution to this in terms of changing everyone's instruction, but we need to support this one teacher as part of the team in developing a solution and check in regularly. So the point is that if you do triennial screening and follow up with some math CBMs, you're going to come up with different recommendation based on the skill, whether it's a grade level problem or a specific teacher problem. And again, by specific teacher problem, the teacher may be strong or weak in teaching something, or they may just have students that via random, allotment come with certain strengths and weaknesses. But either way, it's a group level responsibility to ensure all those students are growing. So again, sorry, I jumped ahead of my arrows, pointing out that with these three skills, most students are weak across the classrooms, and then here it seems to be unique to a specific classroom. Nope, sorry about that. So we can fill out our tips form, right, at the grade level to try to create a solution for this. So instruction, we use the iReady curriculum. And for people familiar with iReady, for example, it tends to emphasize a lot of conceptual knowledge. It tends to emphasize multiple strategies. And so it would make sense that we'd have these grade-wide deficits in computational procedures, subtraction and addition, because that's not, at least in terms of computational fluency, emphasized in iReady. So this is a grade level problem. So what are we going to do about it? So we need a program that has a foundation in fluency and fact recall. That seems to be the skill deficit we have here. One such program is Mind. I'm sure people are familiar with that, or many are. That's a program coming from Brian Ponce and Gary Duhon out of Oklahoma. I know they've presented, or Brian has at earlier today or yesterday, I believe. You can find his website if you just Google Mind Ponce. It's the first thing that comes up, but it's a good program that focuses on fact fluency. And so we'll follow the scope and sequence for Mind, beginning with the earliest skills. We're not going to invent our own materials. We're going to use a reliable vendor. So that's what we're going to do. And what are our goals? Our goal is that both teachers will be independently observed to implement that Mind curriculum with 80% fidelity. There are fidelity forms associated with Mind, and we'll peer observe each other to make sure we're doing it correctly. So the lead teacher will collect and organize, and we want the program implemented with fidelity by October 1st, since this is the fall screening. Curriculum. We currently have a 1-hour math block. During that time, we engage in 20 minutes of independent worksheets, 20 minutes of exploratory manipulative work, and 20 minutes of teacher-led lessons. And we can look at this breakdown and go, okay, what's going on here? Where's the issue? And again, we see a deficit in fluency-based instruction. So what we're going to do is we're going to shave off time from manipulative work and devote that to paired cover, copy, compare. And fortunately, within Mind doesn't just dictate how instruction should occur, it provides the materials. So it provides a curriculum we can layer onto Tier 1 by carving off some of our other time and devoting it to this sort of automaticity and fluency-based program. It provides the materials and the instruction that needs to be provided. And our database goal will expect at least 80% of students to achieve 40 digits correct per minute per skill across those three skills. We're going to go through them sequentially. We'll maybe progress monitor once a week. And we'll review. And then for environment, we'll maintain our PBIS, but we'll integrate the Mind procedures into the PBIS system. So maybe we have tokens for beat your score, right? Or maybe after every Mind session, they take all the worksheets and they shuffle them and they pick one out and they score it without naming names. And if that student beats the class median from last week, that's a class prize. So there's a lot of ways we can yoke this in so it's positive and fun. So this is how we can use that data again to plot this instruction up and then evaluate over time. And we want this again at the grade level. All right, this historically might be something that was at the school level, but we want to empower teachers to be able to make these decisions, and that does require a lot of professional development to give them often these tools so they can sort of self-govern themselves and make good database decisions across the tiers. All right, so sorry, that was a lot. That was my whirlwind tour of a three-level teaming structure integrated within MTSS. I have references here um, that you can check out. And I strongly, strongly encourage you to do so. They're excellent resources that provide a ton of information. And if you want to contact me, here's my email. You can also find me on LinkedIn and ResearchGate. So thank you very much, everyone. I went a little over what I was hoping, but we still have some time for questions.
Hi, Dr. Solomon. This is Julie Brown from Patent Central. I, I'm stepping into Allie's shoes, so to speak. At this time, I do not see any questions in the chat. So you did a very thorough and explicit job of explaining teaming
And,
within an MTSS structure and system.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the chat now. I wasn't able to see it as I was presenting because I was very embarrassed. I forgot the R in smart. Thank you for providing. I see a number of people provided it. You gave me the realistic. Thank you for putting that in the chat. I can't believe I blanked on that.
No worries whatsoever. And thank you all for attending Dr. Solomon's session. You know where to find information for credits. Go to the credit tab on the conference website so you can get your hours for attending the session. And Dr. Solomon, thank you for providing your insightful and informative information. It's very much appreciated here in Pennsylvania and across the United States.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone for attending. I really hope it was useful. And again, if you have any other questions about use of the forums or about the teaming structure or about resources, please feel free to reach out.